That evening, as Tasha sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor, Angela walked in. Her presence immediately filled the room with a sense of reassurance. "Talk to me, sweetheart," she said softly, sitting beside her daughter. Tasha hesitated, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of the day. Angela listened intently, her jaw tightening with every word. By the time Tasha finished, Angela was already forming a plan. "We're not letting this slide," she said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Tasha's shoulder. "You've worked too hard to let someone like Harris tear you down. Tomorrow I'm coming with you to school." Tasha looked at her mother, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. She knew Angela wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to defending her children. For the first time that day, Tasha allowed herself to believe that justice might still be possible. Little did Principal Harris know the next morning would bring a storm he wasn't prepared for. A storm in the form of Tasha Evans, a woman who wouldn't rest until the truth was revealed. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with speculation the day after Tasha's suspension. Groups of students huddled near lockers, their voices hushed but tinged with outrage. "Did you hear about Tasha?" one whispered. "They said she wrote some threatening note, but that doesn't sound like her at all." "Exactly," another chimed in. "She's literally the nicest person in school." The school bell echoed through the hallways of Jefferson High, marking the beginning of another ordinary day, or so it seemed. Tasha Evans, a bright and determined black student with a spotless academic record, was seated in her third-period English class, eagerly participating in a group discussion about civil rights literature. Her classmates admired her confidence and insight, but not everyone in the school shared their appreciation for her intelligence. Principal Walter Harris, a rigid and stern figure known for his strictness, had been observing Tasha closely over the past few weeks. Harris had a reputation for being particularly harsh on students like Tasha, those who were outspoken, unapologetically proud of their heritage, and unafraid to challenge authority. To him, students like Tasha represented a threat to the order he believed the school needed. That morning, during a routine locker check, Harris claimed to have found a crumpled note in Tasha's locker containing inappropriate language and threats directed at a fellow student. Tasha, stunned by the accusation, vehemently denied the note was hers. "This isn't mine," she said firmly, clutching her books. "I've never seen it before." Harris, however, was not interested in her defense. He coldly dismissed her protests, calling her a troublemaker and accusing her of creating disruptions in the school environment. "Enough with the excuses, Miss Evans," he barked. "This kind of behavior won't be tolerated here." Without consulting any witnesses or conducting a thorough investigation, Principal Harris made a snap decision. Tasha was to be suspended immediately for a week. The announcement was delivered in front of her peers, leaving her humiliated and confused. Whispers spread through the hallways as her classmates tried to make sense of what had just happened. Tasha's closest friend, Emily, rushed to her side, but the damage was already done. As Tasha walked out of the principal's office, escorted by a hall monitor, tears streamed down her face. Her mind raced with questions. Why would he do this? How could anyone believe I'd write something like that? Who would plant that note in my locker? The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her. She had always prided herself on being a role model, someone who broke stereotypes and inspired her younger siblings. Now she felt powerless and defeated. News of Tasha's suspension quickly reached her teachers. Mrs. Carter, her English teacher and one of her strongest advocates, was outraged. She knew Tasha's character better than anyone and was convinced there had been a mistake. Or worse, a deliberate targeting. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself, gripping the edge of her desk. "I need to do something." Meanwhile, Tasha's mother, Angela, received the news while working a double shift at the local hospital. Angela was no stranger to fighting battles for her children. A single mother and a veteran, she had raised Tasha to be resilient in the face of adversity. When she heard what had happened, Angela's initial shock quickly turned into determination. "They've messed with the wrong family," she said under her breath, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "Anything's not right about this." Rumors began to swirl, and the story took on a life of its own. Some students believed the official narrative, swayed by Principal Harris's authority, while others were skeptical. Tasha's friends, particularly Emily, knew something was off. Emily was determined to dig deeper. As she made her way to their usual lunch table, she overheard snippets of conversations that only fueled her determination. "She's been on Harris's radar for weeks," a senior said to his friends. "Remember when she spoke up about the lack of diversity in the school curriculum? He didn't like that." Emily nodded silently to herself. That moment had been a turning point. Tasha had always been vocal about issues of fairness and equality, unafraid to call out the administration when necessary. It wasn't uncommon for her to challenge policies that she felt marginalized students, especially those from minority backgrounds. Her courage had inspired many, but it had also drawn the ire of Harris, whose rigid demeanor masked a clear bias. As Emily replayed these thoughts in her mind, she noticed another group of students whispering near the science lab. They weren't just talking about Tasha, they were laughing. Among them was Stephanie, one of Harris's favorite students. Known for her manipulative streak and her close ties to the administration, Stephanie had a reputation for stirring trouble. Emily decided to approach, pretending to search for a book in her locker nearby. "Did you see her face when Harris told her she was suspended?" Stephanie giggled, her voice dripping with mockery. "She didn't even know what hit her." "What if she didn't even write the note?" another student asked hesitantly. Stephanie rolled her eyes. "Please, does it matter? She's always acting like she's better than everyone else. Someone needed to put her in her place." Emily felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to confront Stephanie right then and there. Instead, she stepped away quietly, her mind racing. Could Stephanie have planted the note? It wasn't a far-fetched theory, given her history of causing drama. But without evidence, it would be nearly impossible to prove. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, the faculty was equally divided. Mrs. Carter was pacing back and forth, fuming over the lack of due process. "I don't buy it for a second," she said to Mr. Jacobs, the history teacher. "Tasha isn't capable of something like this. She's one of the most respectful students I've ever taught." Mr. Jacobs nodded thoughtfully. "Harris has always been quick to judge, especially when it comes to students like Tasha. He's never been fair." "But what can we do?" Mrs. Carter pressed. "He's the principal. If we challenge him, we're risking our jobs." "We'll need proof," Mr. Jacobs replied. "Something concrete that shows she was set up. Until then, our hands are tied." Back at home, Tasha sat by her window, staring out at the street below. The world felt like it was closing in on her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Her mother had reassured her that they would fight back, but Tasha's heart ached at the thought of returning to school and facing the judgment of her peers. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Hey, I think I know who's behind this. We need to talk tomorrow. Stay strong." Tasha stared at the screen, a flicker of hope igniting within her. If Emily was onto something, there was a chance to clear her name. The whispers in the hallways, the quiet suspicion among her peers, and the lingering questions in the teacher's lounge were all building toward something bigger. Unbeknownst to Principal Harris, the students and staff were starting to connect the dots. And as the whispers grew louder, so did the resolve of those who believed in Tasha's innocence. The truth was beginning to unravel, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. The next morning, Jefferson High hummed with its usual routine, but the air was heavy with anticipation. As students shuffled through the hallways, many cast nervous glances toward the principal's office. Whispers about Tasha's suspension had not died down. If anything, they'd grown louder. Unbeknownst to everyone, something significant was about to happen, a reckoning that would shake the very foundation of the school's administration. At 9 a.m. sharp, Angela Evans strode through the front doors of Jefferson High. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer and exuding an air of authority, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen and overcome more than most people could imagine. Her eyes were laser-focused, her jaw set in determination. Students passing by stopped and stared, some recognizing Tasha's mother from past parent-teacher meetings, others sensing instinctively that this was a woman on a mission. Angela didn't pause to check in at the front desk. She headed straight to Principal Harris's office, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor like a metronome. The school secretary, Mrs. Bennett, jumped up from her desk as Angela approached. "Ms. Evans," she began nervously, "do you have an appointment? Principal Harris is—" "I don't need an appointment," Angela interrupted, her voice calm but firm. My daughter was unjustly suspended, and I'm here to discuss it. Now." Mrs. Bennet hesitated, glancing toward the closed door of Harris's office. Before she could protest further, Angela brushed past her and knocked loudly on the door before opening it herself. Harris, seated at his desk and reviewing papers, looked up in surprise. "Ms. Evans," he said, his tone clipped. "I wasn't expecting you." "No, I'm sure you weren't," Angela replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "But we need to talk. Right now." Harris leaned back in his chair, attempting to maintain his composure. "If this is about Tasha, I've already made my decision. Her actions—" "Her actions," Angela interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Let's talk about your actions, Principal Harris. You accused my daughter without evidence. You humiliated her in front of her peers and suspended her without giving her a chance to defend herself. That's not discipline. It's discrimination." Harris's expression hardened. "Ms. Evans, I assure you I treat all my students equally. Tasha was found in possession of a threatening note." "A note that someone else could have planted," Angela interjected. "Did you bother to investigate? Did you speak to witnesses? Did you check for fingerprints or handwriting analysis?" Harris bristled. "We don't need to go to those lengths for a school matter. The evidence was sufficient." "Sufficient for what? To punish a black student for being outspoken. To silence her because she dared to stand up for herself and her peers. Let me tell you something, Mr. Harris." Angela leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "You may think you can steamroll over these kids, but you've picked the wrong family to mess with. I'm not just Tasha's mother, I'm her guardian. And I'll do whatever it takes to clear her name." Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Ms. Evans, if you have a formal complaint, you can bring it to the school board. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Angela straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, don't worry. I'll be speaking to the school board. And the PTA, and the local news, if I have to. You're not going to sweep this under the rug." She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving Harris visibly shaken. In the hallway, Angela paused to compose herself. She knew this battle was far from over, but she wasn't one to back down. Her next step was to gather as much evidence as possible, starting with Tasha's friends and teachers. Angela's determination sent ripples through the school. Word spread quickly among students and staff that Tasha's mother had confronted Harris. Many felt a surge of hope, knowing someone was standing up to him. Emily, who had been waiting anxiously near the lockers, ran up to Angela as she exited the office. "Ms. Evans," Emily said breathlessly, "I think I know who's behind this." Angela knelt slightly to meet Emily's gaze. "Tell me everything." As Emily recounted her suspicions about Stephanie and the conversation she overheard, Angela listened intently, her mind racing. She knew this information could be the key to proving Tasha's innocence. With Emily's help and the support of sympathetic teachers like Mrs. Carter, Angela began formulating a plan to expose the truth. That afternoon, as Angela left the school grounds, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Principal Harris had underestimated her, but he was about to learn just how far a guardian would go to protect her child. As the school day unfolded, whispers of Angela Evans' confrontation with Principal Harris spread like wildfire. Students exchanged glances during class, teachers spoke in hushed tones in the lounge, and even the janitorial staff had caught wind of the showdown. However, beneath the surface of Jefferson High, a deeper, more troubling narrative was beginning to emerge. One that explained why Tasha had been targeted so swiftly and harshly. Principal Walter Harris had always presented himself as a man of fairness and integrity, but those who had been at Jefferson High long enough knew there was another side to him. While his disciplinary methods were strict, a troubling pattern had gone unnoticed, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Students of color, particularly those who were outspoken or academically successful, seemed to bear the brunt of his punishments. Mrs. Carter, Tasha's English teacher, had seen this pattern play out time and time again. She had witnessed Harris's reluctance to recognize the achievements of black students, his tendency to give harsher punishments for minor infractions, and his dismissive attitude when confronted about these issues. Yet without concrete evidence, her hands had always been tied. Now, with Tasha's case, she sensed an opportunity to expose the principal's bias. The hidden agenda became clearer as Angela and Mrs. Carter started connecting the dots. Harris's actions weren't merely about maintaining order, they were about control. He had a track record of suppressing students who challenged his authority or questioned the school's outdated policies. Tasha, with her strong voice and willingness to advocate for herself and others, was a direct challenge to his perceived power. Meanwhile, Stephanie, the student suspected of planting the note in Tasha's locker, reveled in the attention she was receiving. Known as one of Harris's favorites, she had always enjoyed a level of protection and favoritism from the administration. Her close relationship with Harris allowed her to skirt the rules, often at the expense of other students. For Stephanie, Tasha's suspension was more than just a prank. It was a way to eliminate someone she saw as competition. As Angela gathered more information, she discovered that this wasn't the first time a student like Tasha had been unfairly targeted. A former student named Malik had been accused of vandalizing school property 2 years prior. Despite a lack of evidence, he had been expelled, and his future had been derailed. Malik's story, shared with Angela by a concerned parent, was eerily similar to Tasha's situation. Angela's frustration grew with every story she uncovered. It was no longer just about clearing her daughter's name, it was about confronting a systemic issue that had been allowed to fester for years. But to take down Harris and expose his hidden agenda, she needed allies. That evening, Angela called a meeting at her home with a small group of parents, teachers, and students who supported Tasha. Mrs. Carter was among them, along with Emily and her parents. The group discussed their experiences, shared evidence, and began formulating a plan to bring Harris's actions to light. "We need to approach the school board with a united front," Angela said, her voice steady but resolute. "This isn't just about Tasha. It's about every student who's been mistreated, every teacher who's been silenced, and every parent who's felt powerless. We're not going to let this continue." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Carter spoke up, her voice tinged with urgency. "We need to act quickly. Harris is going to do everything he can to cover his tracks, but if we present enough evidence and rally the community, he won't be able to ignore us." Angela's plan was ambitious but necessary. They would gather testimonies from former students, compile evidence of Harris's discriminatory practices, and present their findings to the school board at the next meeting. They also decided to involve the local press, ensuring the story would reach a wider audience. As the meeting concluded, Angela felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced since the ordeal began. The fight ahead would be tough, but she was surrounded by people who believed in justice and were willing to stand with her. The next day, as Jefferson High buzzed with rumors of Angela's efforts, Harris began to feel the pressure. He couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, the principal who had ruled the school with an iron fist was beginning to fear what might happen if the truth came out. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine Tasha's future, but also uncover the hidden prejudices that had plagued Jefferson High for far too long. The following morning, Angela Evans sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The house was quiet, but her mind was anything but. The weight of the fight ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet she radiated a calm determination. She had faced tougher battles in her life, and this would be no different. For Angela, protecting her daughter wasn't just an obligation, it was a calling. Tasha entered the room, her eyes still puffy from restless sleep. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to approach the situation. She admired her mother's strength, but couldn't help feeling guilty for the turmoil her suspension had caused. "Morning, Mom," she said softly. Angela looked up and smiled, her face instantly softening. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" Tasha shrugged, dropping into the chair across from her. "Not really. I keep thinking about school, about what everyone's saying. What if they don't believe me, Mom? What if they think I'm just some troublemaker?" Angela reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Tasha, listen to me," she said firmly. "You are not a troublemaker. You're a fighter. You stand up for what's right, and that scares people like Principal Harris. But we're not going to let him win. I promise you, we're going to clear your name." Tasha nodded, her mother's words easing some of her anxiety. Still, doubt lingered. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. Angela's grip on her hand tightened. "It will be," she said, her voice unwavering, "because we're not fighting this alone. You have people who believe in you, your friends, your teachers, and me. Together, we're unstoppable." Later that day, Angela began executing her plan with precision. She started by contacting parents of other students who had experienced Harris's harsh disciplinary actions. Many of them were hesitant to speak up, fearing retaliation, but Angela's conviction was contagious. One by one, they shared their stories, painting a damning picture of a principal who wielded his authority unfairly. Angela also reached out to Malik, the former student who had been expelled under suspicious circumstances. He was now working at a local community center, mentoring kids who had faced similar struggles. When Angela explained the situation, Malik didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever I can to help," he said. "No one should have to go through what I did." Meanwhile, Tasha's friends were rallying their classmates. Emily, ever the loyal ally, took charge, organizing a petition demanding an investigation into Harris's actions. "This isn't just about Tasha," she told a group of students during lunch. "It's about standing up to someone who thinks they can treat us however they want. Are we going to let that slide?" The students responded with enthusiasm, signing the petition and spreading the word. By the end of the day, nearly half the school had added their names. Angela's silent strength extended beyond her determination. It was in her ability to inspire others to act. She knew that change didn't happen overnight, but with every conversation, every phone call, and every new ally, she was building a powerful case against Harris. That evening, as Angela reviewed the growing stack of evidence on the dining table, Tasha sat beside her, watching in awe. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. "How do you do it, Mom?" she asked. "How do you stay so strong?" Angela paused, looking at her daughter with a mixture of pride and love. "Because I have to," she said simply, "because I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be told you don't matter. And I refuse to let anyone make you feel that way. You're worth fighting for, Tasha, and I'll fight for you until my last breath." Tasha's eyes welled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of gratitude and admiration for a mother who had taught her the true meaning of resilience. As the night wore on, the Evans household became a hub of activity. Parents dropped by to share their stories, students brought updates on the petition, and Mrs. Carter stopped by with additional documents she had collected. The momentum was building, and Angela could feel the tide beginning to turn. Principal Harris had underestimated Angela Evans. He thought he could silence her daughter with a quick suspension, but he had awakened a force far greater than he could have anticipated. Angela's silent strength wasn't just hers. It was a beacon that drew others to her cause. Together, they were on the brink of exposing the truth and ensuring justice for Tasha and every other student who had been wronged. And Angela knew deep in her heart that they were just getting started. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Jefferson High, casting long shadows across the hallways. Students shuffled to their classes, whispering about the growing tension surrounding Tasha's suspension. Inside the school office, Principal Harris sat at his desk, reviewing a stack of papers with a furrowed brow. The events of the past few days had begun to rattle him, though he'd never admit it. Angela Evans walked into the school office, her presence commanding attention. She carried a leather-bound folder under her arm, its contents carefully curated evidence of Harris's questionable practices. Behind her was Mrs. Carter, Tasha's English teacher, who had offered to provide moral support. Angela had called ahead to request a meeting, and Harris had begrudgingly agreed, though he had no intention of conceding anything. The school secretary, Mrs. Bennett, looked up nervously as Angela approached. "Ms. Evans, Principal Harris will see you now," she said, her voice tinged with unease. Angela nodded and pushed open the office door, stepping inside with quiet confidence. Harris didn't bother to stand as Angela entered. "Ms. Evans," he said curtly, motioning for her to sit. "I assume you're here to discuss your daughter's suspension again. As I've stated before, the matter is closed." Angela placed the folder on his desk and remained standing. "You might think it's closed, but it's far from over," she replied evenly. "I've come to present evidence that my daughter was unjustly accused and to demand a formal investigation into your actions." Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of annoyance and skepticism. Evidence? He scoffed. What evidence could possibly exonerate her? The note was found in her locker. Angela opened the folder and began laying out documents on the desk. This is a copy of the petition signed by over 200 students who believe my daughter was set up. These are written statements from Tasha's classmates attesting to her character and behavior. And this, she said, pulling out a final sheet, is a transcript of a conversation between two students overheard in the hallway, one of whom admitted to planting the note in her locker. Harris's composure faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Ms. Evans, hallway gossip isn't evidence, and a petition doesn't change the fact that Tasha broke the rules. She didn't break any rules, Angela shot back, her voice steady but firm. You targeted her because she speaks out against injustice, because she refuses to be silenced. This isn't about discipline. It's about your unwillingness to tolerate students who challenge your authority. Harris's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, he said, his tone icy. It's not an accusation, it's a fact, Angela replied, and I have more than enough evidence to take this to the school board. I've already scheduled a meeting with them for next week. If you'd like to explain your actions to them directly, I suggest you start preparing your defense. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Harris's face. He was used to parents who backed down in the face of his authority, but Angela Evans was unlike anyone he had dealt with before. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter, she was fighting to expose a deeper injustice, and she wasn't afraid to take the fight to the highest level. Mrs. Carter, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Principal Harris, I've worked at this school for over a decade, and I've seen the patterns. Tasha isn't the first student to be unfairly targeted, but I'll do everything in my power to ensure she's the last. Harris glared at her but didn't respond. The tension in the room was palpable, but Angela wasn't finished. You underestimated my daughter, she said, her voice calm but resolute, and you underestimated me. This is bigger than Tasha's suspension. It's about ensuring that no other student has to endure the same treatment. You've built your career on fear and intimidation, but that ends now. Angela closed the folder and straightened, her gaze locked on Harris. I'll see you at the school board meeting, she said, before turning and walking out of the office with Mrs. Carter by her side. As the door closed behind them, Harris sat in silence, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. For the first time, he realized he was no longer in control of the narrative. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble, and the truth was closing in. Meanwhile, Angela walked out of the office with her head held high. She knew the battle was far from over, but she also knew she had taken a crucial step toward justice. Tasha's fight had become a rallying cry for change, and Angela was determined to see it through to the end. The day of the school board meeting arrived, and the atmosphere at Jefferson High was electric. Students whispered excitedly in the hallways, teachers exchanged knowing glances, and even the usually stoic staff seemed on edge. Word had spread that Angela Evans had gathered enough evidence to challenge Principal Harris's decision, and possibly his position. Angela walked into the school auditorium with Tasha by her side. The room was already buzzing with activity. Parents, teachers, and community members filled the seats, their eyes turning toward Angela as she entered. Despite the weight of the moment, she exuded an unshakable calm. Her folder of evidence was clutched firmly in her hand, ready to be presented. The school board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, their faces neutral but attentive. At the far end of the table sat Principal Harris, his expression a mixture of irritation and unease. He had prepared his defense, but deep down he knew the scales were tipping against him. As the meeting began, the board chair introduced the case and invited Angela to speak. She rose from her seat, her voice steady as she addressed the room. Good evening, members of the board, faculty, and community, she began. I'm here today not only as a mother, but as an advocate for justice. My daughter, Tasha Evans, was suspended without proper evidence, and I believe this decision reflects a pattern of systemic bias within this school. Angela laid out her case piece by piece. She began with Tasha's academic record and spotless behavior, emphasizing her leadership qualities and dedication to her studies. Then she presented the petition signed by students, along with statements from her teachers, including Mrs. Carter, attesting to her integrity. Here's where things become troubling, Angela continued, her voice unwavering. This is a transcript of a conversation overheard between two students. One of them, Stephanie Miller, admitted to planting the note in my daughter's locker. This act was not only malicious, but also orchestrated with the knowledge that Tasha would be unfairly targeted. The room erupted in murmurs. Stephanie, seated in the audience, shrank in her chair, her face turning pale. Angela didn't stop there. She presented evidence of previous incidents, including Malik's case and other examples of disproportionate punishment against minority students. Principal Harris has a history of using his authority to silence students who challenge him, Angela said, her voice gaining strength. This isn't about discipline, it's about control. And it's time we hold him accountable. The board members listened intently, their expressions growing graver with each piece of evidence. When Angela finished, she took her seat, her heart pounding, but her resolve intact. She glanced at Tasha, who gave her a small, grateful smile. Next, Harris was invited to respond. He rose from his seat, his face tight with frustration. "These accusations are baseless," he began, his voice clipped. "Every decision I've made has been in the best interest of the school. The note was found in Tasha's locker. Those are the facts." But the weight of Angela's evidence was too great to dismiss. As Harris spoke, it became clear he was on the defensive, grasping at straws to justify his actions. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a palpable sense of disbelief and disapproval filling the room. Then Mrs. Carter stood to speak. "I've worked under Principal Harris for years," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she continued, "and I've seen the impact of his decisions. Tasha is not the first student to be treated unfairly, but I'm here to make sure she's the last." Other parents and students followed, sharing their own experiences and supporting Angela's claims. Each story painted a damning picture of Harris's leadership, leaving the board members visibly troubled. Finally, the board chair called for order and addressed the room. "We take these allegations very seriously," she said. "We will conduct a thorough investigation into this matter. In the meantime, Tasha Evans's suspension is hereby revoked, and her record will be cleared." The room broke into applause. Tasha's eyes filled with tears of relief, and Angela wrapped an arm around her shoulders. But the board chair wasn't finished. "As for Principal Harris, we will be reviewing his actions and leadership as part of this investigation. Effective immediately, he is placed on administrative leave." Harris's face turned ashen as the audience erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. The tide had turned, and the truth had finally come to light. As the meeting adjourned, Angela and Tasha were surrounded by supporters, students, parents, and teachers alike, thanking them for their courage. Angela felt a wave of pride and gratitude. This was more than just a victory for her daughter, it was a step toward lasting change. The battle wasn't over, but the first and most important fight had been won. Together, they had unveiled the truth and paved the way for a brighter, fairer future at Jefferson High. The air in Jefferson High was charged with tension the next day. Principal Harris's administrative leave had become the talk of the school, and students who once feared his authority now walked the hallways with a sense of cautious liberation. However, for Tasha and her mother, Angela, the fight wasn't entirely over. There was still one final confrontation to be had, one that would solidify the justice they had fought so hard for. As Angela and Tasha entered the school that morning, they were met with warm smiles and words of encouragement from students and staff alike. Mrs. Carter greeted them at the front door, her expression a mixture of relief and pride. "You've done more for this school than you realize," she said, giving Tasha a reassuring pat on the shoulder. But Angela wasn't satisfied with just Harris's suspension. She wanted accountability, and to ensure that, she had requested a meeting with Stephanie Miller, the student responsible for framing Tasha. Stephanie had been silent during the school board meeting, but Angela knew that the young girl's actions couldn't go unaddressed. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about teaching a lesson that could prevent future harm. In a small conference room near the principal's office, Stephanie sat nervously, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Her parents were seated beside her, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and disappointment. Angela and Tasha entered the room with calm yet purposeful strides, accompanied by Mrs. Carter, who had agreed to mediate the discussion. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Angela began, her voice steady but firm. She directed her gaze at Stephanie, who avoided eye contact. Stephanie, do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Stephanie nodded hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far, she admitted. I was jealous of Tasha. She always gets so much attention, and I just wanted her to, I don't know, feel what it's like to be ignored. Tasha's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and hurt flashing across her face. Before she could respond, Angela spoke. Jealousy doesn't excuse your actions, Stephanie. You planted a false note, humiliated my daughter, and allowed her to be punished for something she didn't do. Do you realize how much damage that caused? Stephanie's mother, clearly mortified, chimed in. We are so sorry, Ms. Evans. We had no idea Stephanie was capable of something like this. We'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Angela held up a hand to quiet her. This isn't just about an apology, she said. Stephanie, you need to take responsibility for your actions. That means acknowledging what you did, not only to us, but to the entire school community. Stephanie hesitated before nodding. I'm sorry, Tasha, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to ruin your life. I was wrong. Tasha, who had been silent until now, took a deep breath. I appreciate your apology, but it doesn't change what happened, she said, her voice steady. What you did hurt me more than you'll ever know. But if you're really sorry, you need to prove it by making things right. Angela leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. Stephanie, this is your opportunity to learn from this. You can either let this mistake define you, or you can grow from it. What matters now is how you choose to move forward. The meeting concluded with Stephanie agreeing to publicly apologize during an upcoming school assembly, where the events surrounding Tasha's suspension and Harris's actions would be addressed. Angela and Tasha left the room feeling a sense of closure, though the emotions of the encounter lingered. As they walked down the hallway, Tasha turned to her mother. Do you think she meant it? She asked quietly. Angela smiled faintly. I think she's scared, and sometimes fear is the first step toward change. Only time will tell if she truly understands the impact of what she's done. Later that day, an announcement was made that a special assembly would be held to address the events that had transpired. Students and staff alike buzzed with curiosity, eager to hear the full story. For Tasha, it was a chance to reclaim her voice and show the school that standing up for what's right was always worth the fight. The confrontation with Stephanie had been difficult, but it was a necessary step toward healing. Angela knew that this journey was about more than just setting the record straight. It was about creating a culture of accountability and respect within the school. And in that moment, as she watched Tasha walk confidently toward her next class, she felt a sense of pride and hope that the seeds of change had been firmly planted. The school assembly was unlike any Jefferson High had seen before. The entire student body and faculty gathered in the gymnasium, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Principal Harris's absence was palpable, his usual stern presence replaced by a panel of school board members and Angela Evans, who sat at the center of the stage with Tasha by her side. Stephanie Miller was also present, seated nervously at the edge of the stage, flanked by her parents. As the room settled into an uneasy quiet, the board chair stepped forward to address the crowd. Today's assembly is about accountability and transparency, she began. We are here to address recent events involving one of our students, Tasha Evans, and the actions of our administration. It is also an opportunity to reflect on how we, as a community, can do better. Angela stood next, her calm demeanor radiating strength. She spoke with conviction, recounting the events that led to Tasha's suspension and the efforts made to uncover the truth. She emphasized the importance of standing up against injustice and how the students themselves played a pivotal role in bringing the truth to light. You all have more power than you realize, Angela said, her gaze sweeping across the room. When you see something wrong, speak out. When you know someone is being treated unfairly, stand with them. Together you can create change. The students erupted in applause, their admiration for Angela evident. When the noise subsided, the board chair invited Tasha to speak. Tasha hesitated for a moment, then rose, her heart pounding. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all watching her with anticipation. I want to thank everyone who believed in me and supported me, Tasha began, her voice steady despite her nerves. This experience has been one of the hardest of my life, but it's also taught me the importance of resilience and community. What happened to me wasn't just about a false accusation, it was about a system that allows people in power to act without accountability. That needs to change. Her words resonated deeply with her peers, many of whom had felt powerless against the administration in the past. As Tasha sat down, the applause was deafening. The board chair then turned to Stephanie, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "Stephanie Miller has something she would like to say," the chair announced. Stephanie stood slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. I want to apologize," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "To Tasha, to her family, and to everyone here. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. I was jealous and acted out of spite, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." She paused, her voice breaking. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I promise to do better. I'll take responsibility for my actions, and I hope someday I can earn back the trust I've lost." The room was silent for a moment before a few students began clapping, a tentative but significant sign of encouragement. Stephanie returned to her seat, visibly relieved to have spoken her truth. But the most powerful moment of the assembly came when the board chair opened the floor to students. One by one, they began to stand and share their own experiences with injustice at Jefferson High. Some spoke about unfair treatment from the administration, while others highlighted the lack of representation in the school's curriculum and policies. Each voice added to the growing chorus of change, creating a powerful sense of unity. Emily, Tasha's best friend, was among those who spoke. "Tasha is one of the strongest people I know," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "She stood up for herself and for all of us, even when it felt like the whole world was against her. If we all had a fraction of her courage, imagine what we could accomplish." By the end of the assembly, the energy in the gym was electric. Students left feeling empowered, teachers felt inspired, and the school board members had a clearer understanding of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Angela and Tasha walked out together, surrounded by students and staff who offered their support and gratitude. For the first time since the ordeal began, Tasha felt a sense of belonging and pride. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had inspired others to find theirs. The assembly marked a turning point for Jefferson High. It wasn't just a moment of accountability, it was the beginning of a movement, led by students who refused to accept the status quo. And at the heart of it all was Tasha, a girl who had been silenced but chose to speak louder than ever before. As the weeks passed after the school assembly, Jefferson High began to transform. The once oppressive atmosphere of fear and unchecked authority was replaced by a cautious but growing sense of accountability. Students walked the hallways with their heads held high, inspired by Tasha's courage and Angela's unwavering determination. But amidst the change, one question lingered among many. How had Angela Evans managed to stand so tall against such formidable opposition? It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate about Angela's background. The students, fascinated by her composure and authority, started digging for answers. Tasha, too, had often wondered about the quiet strength her mother seemed to possess. Angela rarely talked about her past, choosing instead to focus on the present and her children's futures. But as more people began to inquire, Angela decided it was time to share her story. Not to boast, but to inspire. One crisp morning, during a small gathering in the school library organized by Mrs. Carter, Angela stood before a group of students and teachers. She had been invited to speak about her experiences and the lessons she had learned along the way. The room was filled with eager faces, including Tasha's, who had never heard her mother open up like this before. "I wasn't always this strong," Angela began, her voice calm and reflective. "There was a time in my life when I doubted myself, when I thought I wasn't enough. But life has a way of testing you, and it's through those tests that you discover what you're truly capable of." She paused, glancing at Tasha with a proud smile. "Many of you might not know this, but I served in the United States Marine Corps. It was one of the most challenging and transformative experiences of my life. The discipline, the resilience, the ability to face adversity head-on, it all started there." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Tasha's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and awe washing over her. While she had known about her mother's military service in vague terms, she hadn't grasped the depth of it until now. Angela continued, her tone growing firmer. The Marines taught me that strength isn't just about physical power. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves and being a voice for the voiceless. Those lessons have guided me every day since. She looked out at the students, her gaze steady. When I saw what was happening to Tasha, I knew I had to act. Not just as her mother, but as someone who believes in justice. I couldn't let fear or doubt stop me because I knew the stakes were too high. And I want all of you to know, you have that same strength inside of you. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Angela. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who had witnessed the recent events at Jefferson High. For many, she wasn't just a mother, she was a symbol of resilience and hope. As the session ended, students and teachers lined up to thank Angela for her courage and inspiration. Tasha approached her last, her expression a mixture of pride and admiration. "I had no idea, Mom," she said quietly. "You've been through so much." Angela smiled and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "And so have you, Tasha. You've shown strength in ways I never could have imagined. I'm so proud of you." From that day forward, Angela's story became a part of the school's narrative, a reminder that one person's determination could ignite change. For Tasha, knowing her mother's history gave her a deeper understanding of the strength she carried within herself. It wasn't just about fighting injustice, it was about creating a legacy of resilience and empowerment. And so, Angela Evans's identity as both a guardian and a warrior became a source of inspiration, not just for Tasha, but for an entire school learning to find its voice. The school board meeting to finalize the investigation into Principal Harris's actions was held in the Grand Conference Hall of the district office. The room was filled with concerned parents, teachers, and even some students who had come to witness the outcome of a fight that had gripped Jefferson High for weeks. Angela Evans, as always, sat front and center, her calm yet commanding presence a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Tasha sat beside her mother, clutching her notebook tightly. She felt nervous but also hopeful. The events of the past weeks had brought her school community together in ways she hadn't thought possible. She knew that this meeting could mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for every student at Jefferson High. At the front of the room, the school board members sat behind a long table, their expressions serious. The board chair began the meeting by summarizing the case against Principal Harris and outlining the findings of their investigation. "We have reviewed the evidence presented by Ms. Evans and other concerned parties," the chair announced. "We have also conducted our own inquiry, interviewing students, staff, and parents. The results of this investigation have revealed troubling patterns of bias and misconduct." A murmur rippled through the audience. Harris, seated to the side with his attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usually confident demeanor had been replaced by a nervous rigidity, his fingers tapping the table in a steady rhythm. Angela listened intently as the board laid out their findings. They highlighted several instances where Harris had disproportionately disciplined minority students, citing records and testimonies from staff. They also addressed his failure to conduct a fair investigation into Tasha's case, emphasizing the lack of evidence supporting her suspension. As a result, the board chair continued, "We have determined that Principal Harris violated both school district policies and the ethical standards required of his position. Effective immediately, Mr. Harris will be terminated from his role as principal of Jefferson High." The room erupted in applause and cheers, though Harris remained stone-faced. For Angela, the announcement was a moment of vindication. She had fought tirelessly to expose the truth, and now justice had been served. But the board wasn't done. The chair raised her hand, quieting the room. "This case has highlighted systemic issues within our district that go beyond one individual. We are committed to addressing these problems by implementing new policies to ensure fairness and equity for all students." The board outlined several initiatives, including mandatory diversity training for staff, the establishment of a student advisory council, and the creation of an anonymous reporting system for incidents of bias or misconduct. These measures were met with widespread approval, with many attendees expressing hope for a brighter future. When the floor was opened for public comment, Angela stood and addressed the board. Her voice was calm but firm, her words carrying the weight of weeks of struggle. "Thank you for taking this issue seriously," she began. "But I urge you to remember that true change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from people. It comes from a commitment to listening to students, empowering teachers, and holding ourselves accountable." Her speech was met with a standing ovation. As Angela sat down, Tasha leaned over and whispered, "You're amazing, Mom." Angela smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "And so are you," she replied. "Don't ever forget that." As the meeting concluded, Angela and Tasha were approached by parents, teachers, and even board members who thanked them for their courage and perseverance. The outcome of the meeting was more than they could have hoped for. It wasn't just about justice for Tasha. It was about creating lasting change for Jefferson High. Outside the building, as the evening sky turned a deep shade of blue, Tasha took a deep breath. "It's over," she said softly. Angela placed an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "No, sweetheart," she said with a smile, "this is just the beginning." With Harris gone and a new era of accountability on the horizon, Jefferson High was poised for a brighter future. And at the heart of it all was a mother and daughter who had refused to stay silent, proving that one voice, when amplified by courage and conviction, could truly make a difference. The day following the school board's decision, Jefferson High was abuzz with discussions about what had transpired. For the first time in years, students and staff felt a sense of hope that real change was on the horizon. Yet, for Tasha and Angela, the fight wasn't entirely over. While the principal had been removed, there was still a need to address the emotional scars left behind by the ordeal. In a symbolic gesture of accountability, the school administration scheduled a special assembly to formally apologize to Tasha and the other students who had been wronged under Harris's tenure. The event was not only an acknowledgement of past mistakes, but also a commitment to building a better future for everyone at Jefferson High. The gymnasium was packed as students, teachers, and parents gathered to witness the school's first steps toward reconciliation. The interim principal, Mrs. Albright, a veteran educator with a reputation for fairness and empathy, stood at the podium. Her voice was steady as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we acknowledge the harm caused by actions that were unjust and unacceptable," Mrs. Albright began. "On behalf of Jefferson High, I want to apologize to Tasha Evans and her family. What happened to her was wrong, and it does not reflect the values we strive to uphold." The crowd erupted into applause, with many students standing to show their support. Tasha, seated in the front row beside her mother, felt a mixture of emotions: relief, validation, and a renewed sense of belonging. Mrs. Albright continued, outlining the steps the school would take to ensure such incidents would not happen again. "We are implementing new training for staff, creating safe spaces for students to voice concerns, and establishing a student-led equity council to guide us in making Jefferson High a place where everyone feels valued." After Mrs. Albright's address, Stephanie Miller was invited to the stage to deliver her public apology. The room fell silent as Stephanie, visibly nervous, approached the microphone. She took a deep breath, clutching her prepared notes in trembling hands. "Tasha," Stephanie began, her voice cracking slightly, "I want to say I'm sorry. I know what I did was wrong, and I know that no apology can undo the hurt I caused you. I acted out of jealousy and ignorance, and I let my insecurities drive me to hurt someone who didn't deserve it." She paused, glancing nervously at Tasha, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "I promise to do better, not just in my actions, but in how I treat others. I'm working to understand the impact of what I did, and I hope one day I can earn your forgiveness." The audience remained silent for a moment before a few students began clapping, their support growing louder with each passing second. Stephanie returned to her seat, her face a mixture of relief and regret. Finally, it was Tasha's turn to speak. Rising from her chair, she walked to the stage with quiet confidence, her mother's reassuring presence grounding her. Standing at the podium, she took a moment to gather her thoughts before addressing the crowd. "I never thought I'd find myself in this position," Tasha began, her voice strong yet emotional. "But this experience has taught me so much about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." She glanced at Stephanie, then at the students and teachers before her. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them. I accept Stephanie's apology, and I hope this is a turning point not just for her, but for all of us. We have the power to create a better school, a better community, where everyone feels seen and respected." The gym erupted in applause once more, and Tasha returned to her seat, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Angela hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." That day marked a new beginning for Jefferson High. Apologies had been made, accountability had been taken, and a path toward healing had been set. For Tasha, it was a moment of closure and triumph, a testament to the strength she had found within herself and the unwavering support of her mother. As the assembly concluded, Tasha and Angela walked out of the gym together, surrounded by friends, teachers, and students who had become allies in their journey. The road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were truly moving forward. Together. The days following the assembly brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Jefferson High. Tasha, once a target of suspicion and humiliation, had become a symbol of resilience and strength. Students who had once stayed silent about injustices began to speak out, encouraged by her bravery. Teachers who had hesitated to challenge unfair policies now felt empowered to advocate for their students. For Tasha, the change was overwhelming but also deeply fulfilling. Walking down the hallways, she was greeted with smiles, nods, and words of encouragement. Students she had never spoken to before thanked her for standing up not just for herself but for everyone. It was a stark contrast to the isolation she had felt during her suspension. Her closest friends, led by Emily, decided to celebrate Tasha's victory in their own way. They organized a surprise party at the local community center, inviting classmates and teachers who had supported her throughout the ordeal. When Tasha arrived, she was greeted with cheers and applause, her cheeks flushing with a mix of joy and embarrassment. "You didn't have to do this," Tasha said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We wanted to," Emily replied with a grin. "You've been through so much, and you deserve to be celebrated." The party was a mix of laughter and heartfelt moments. Mrs. Carter gave a short speech, praising Tasha's courage and leadership. "You've shown us all what it means to stand up for what's right," she said, "and I have no doubt you'll continue to inspire everyone around you." Tasha's heart swelled with pride and gratitude as she listened. For so long she had felt like her voice didn't matter, but now she saw the impact she had made, not just on her school, but on her community. In the following weeks, Tasha embraced her new role as a student leader. She was invited to join the newly formed Student Equity Council, where she worked alongside peers and teachers to address issues of fairness and inclusion. Her insights and experiences became invaluable as the council developed initiatives to make Jefferson High a more welcoming place for all students. One of Tasha's first projects was creating a mentorship program for younger students, particularly those who felt marginalized or overlooked. Drawing from her own experiences, she wanted to ensure that no one else would have to face the challenges she had endured alone. The program quickly gained traction, with dozens of students signing up to participate. Outside of school, Tasha's story continued to spread. Local news outlets covered her journey, highlighting the broader issues of bias and inequality in schools. Angela, always by her side, used these opportunities to advocate for systemic change, pushing for reforms that extended beyond Jefferson High. The support and recognition were overwhelming at times, but Tasha remained grounded. She knew that the true triumph wasn't in the accolades or applause. It was in the relationships she had built and the changes she had helped spark. Every time she saw a younger student smile with newfound confidence or heard a teacher express renewed commitment to fairness, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. One day, as Tasha walked through the halls with Emily, she noticed a poster on the wall advertising the mentorship program. It featured a photo of Tasha speaking at the assembly, her words emblazoned below. "We have the power to create a better school, a better community, where everyone feels seen and respected." Tasha stopped to look at it, a small smile playing on her lips. "I can't believe that's me," she said softly. Emily nudged her playfully. "Believe it. You've done something amazing, Tasha, and this is just the beginning." Tasha nodded, her smile widening. She knew Emily was right. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. With her mother's strength as her foundation and the support of her friends and community, Tasha had proven that one voice could spark change, and that change, once ignited, could spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The final weeks of the school year at Jefferson High marked a turning point for both the students and staff. The changes initiated in the wake of Tasha's ordeal had begun to take root, creating a more inclusive and supportive environment. For Tasha, life had shifted dramatically. No longer seen as a victim, she had become a leader and a symbol of resilience. Sitting in her bedroom one evening, Tasha reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been far from easy, but it had taught her lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. She glanced at her desk, where a stack of letters from fellow students sat, a testament to the impact her courage had made. Many of them had written to thank her, sharing how her fight had inspired them to stand up for themselves and others. Angela walked in, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She handed one to Tasha and sat beside her. "You've come a long way, kiddo," Angela said, her voice filled with pride. Tasha smiled, sipping her drink. "We both have, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Angela chuckled softly. "Maybe, but don't sell yourself short. You're the one who stood up in front of everyone and told your truth. That's something most people never find the courage to do." Tasha nodded, thinking back to the assembly, the board meeting, and every moment that had brought her to this point. "I think the hardest part," she said slowly, "was realizing that not everyone wanted to hear the truth. But once I started speaking, I realized how many people needed to hear it." Angela reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "And that's what makes you a leader, Tasha. It's not just about fighting for yourself, it's about fighting for others, even when it's hard." The next morning, Tasha arrived at school to find the Student Equity Council hard at work. Together, they had developed plans for workshops on diversity, peer mentoring programs, and even a cultural appreciation week to celebrate the different backgrounds of Jefferson High's students. Tasha felt a sense of pride as she looked around the room, seeing her classmates working together toward a common goal. Later that day, Mrs. Carter pulled Tasha aside after class. "I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said. "You've shown this school what it means to be brave and compassionate. You've not only changed the way we think, you've changed the way we act." Tasha felt her cheeks flush with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I couldn't have done it without you." The teacher smiled warmly. "You did more than you realize, and I hope you carry that with you, no matter where life takes you." As the school year came to a close, Jefferson High held its annual awards ceremony. To no one's surprise, Tasha was called to the stage to receive a special recognition for her contributions to the school community. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces, her peers, her teachers, and her mother, who watched with tears of pride. "This isn't just my award," Tasha said, her voice steady and confident. "It belongs to everyone who stood by me, who believed in me, and who refused to let injustice go unanswered. Together, we've proven that one voice can make a difference, but many voices can create a movement." The crowd erupted into applause, and Tasha stepped off the stage, her heart full. As she returned to her seat, Angela wrapped her in a tight hug. "You've always been my star," she whispered, "and now the whole world knows it." In the weeks that followed, Jefferson High continued to transform. The mentorship program flourished, the new policies took effect, and the students felt a renewed sense of ownership over their school. Tasha knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face and battles to fight. But she felt ready. For Tasha and Angela, this chapter was more than just a victory. It was a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and unity. Together, they had not only changed their school, but had also inspired a community to stand for justice. As Tasha prepared for the next steps in her life, she carried with her the lessons learned from this experience. That strength comes from standing together, that change begins with courage, and that even in the face of adversity, hope always prevails. It was truly a new beginning.